All right, everyone, it's 1 o'clock. Welcome back to the Interdisciplinary Conservation Seminar series with the Human Environment Systems group at Boise State. My name is Matt Williamson. I'm an assistant professor here in Human Environment Systems, and I'll be your host for the rest of the semester. A few things before we get started. The session is going to be recorded. You'll get a link to the recording once it's up on the College of Innovation and Design's YouTube channel, probably within a week or so. When you come in, you're going to be muted. So when you go to ask questions, please be sure to unmute yourself. For most of the presentation, we ask that you keep your cameras off just to allow the streaming to be as smooth as possible. We'll hold questions until the end, but you're welcome to post them in the chat as they come and I can field them and pass them on. You can check out the rest of the schedule for the fall at the link here. Just an update, next week our seminar is going to be on Friday rather than on Wednesday to allow people to have some space from the election. So just want to say that we know that continued violence towards Black and brown people in the US is sort of an ongoing phenomenon throughout the summer. Yet another fire is causing the evacuation of a few 100,000 people in California. We're approaching an election that is probably one of the most contentious most of us have seen in a while. All that is to say, we imagine that we're all showing up today in probably very different places and maybe a little stretched thin. We're really grateful that you're here, and we ask that you be kind to each other and most especially to yourself. We're grateful you're here. I'm really excited to be able to introduce Sheila Colla from York University, who's our speaker today. Sheila is currently the York Research Chair in Interdisciplinary Science within the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York University. For the last decade, she's been working at the forefront of pollinator conservation, identifying the causes for widespread declines in native bees across North America and working with NGOs, landowners, and policymakers to develop solutions to slow those declines. Sheila is the North American co-coordinator of the IUCN Bumblebee Specialist Group, the co-author of several identification guides for bees, and her work has been featured in journals like Conservation Biology, Conservation Letters, Science, and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Her work has recently begun to shift from being focused on the ecological relationships of pollinators towards the human dimensions of conservation. She'll be speaking to us today about the story behind that shift and some of her new work within the context of the Finding Flowers project. So with that, I would like to turn it over to you, Sheila.
Thanks, Matt. I think I accidentally muted you earlier. I was trying to admit someone in the room and it kind of moved up and I muted you. So that's what happened there in case you were wondering. All right, so today's talk is something that I haven't really talked about too much before. Come on, slides. I got too used to this one. Okay, seems to be okay now. You can still see my presentation? Yeah, okay, cool. So yeah, I deliberately titled this slide "Examining Intersections of Pollinator Conservation and Social Justice" because I'm really just starting to think about things. I don't have any answers, so if you came here for answers, I have none. I'll just say that right from the beginning. So I'm gonna turn off my video and hope that that makes things a little bit faster for my presentation. Okay, so I will basically just go through these 3 parts of my talk, and it's kind of funny that Matt just introduced me because I'm going to spend the first little bit giving myself, I guess, introducing you all to some of the stuff that I've been working on and doing. And part of that is so that you have a little context of where I'm coming from and why I've decided to sort of go in the direction that I'm going. Matt, I don't actually see this being recorded. Is it being recorded?
It is, yep.
Okay, perfect. So then after that, I will go into the human dimensions of pollinator conservation and talk a little bit about that. And then more recently, this Finding Flowers project that I've been working on with some of my colleagues. So my name is Sheila. My pronouns are she, her. I am speaking in Toronto, which has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis, and is now home to many Indigenous people. You can find me here on Twitter. I have two websites, I guess, that you can get to me through. So bees@yorku.ca. I'm part of a larger bee research group. There's 5 PIs from York who are working on different components of bee research. And then my lab website, which is savethebumblebees.ca. I am a person of color. My mom came here as a refugee. My dad also came here as an immigrant. So both of my parents were not born in Canada. I'm a settler. There's a lot of things about my position that I try to think about when I'm talking about my academic position and also how I approach my research. So just some things that I might just touch on going through this talk. I came through all of this with a very strong Western science, I guess, background. I went to the University of Toronto for, I guess, human biology to begin with, and then switched into zoology. I did my PhD in biology. I really have been focused on the natural sciences for a long time, and it's the only real worldview, I guess, that I formally learned about when thinking about pollinators and conservation. In this middle picture here, you can see what I spent a lot of my time doing and really what I'm probably most trained to do, which is look for flowers, and the title Finding Flowers, and on these flowers, look for bees. So essentially my PhD research was about looking for bees on flowers and counting them and looking for rare species. And that's how I spent a lot of my time, or I guess I should say not finding rare species, which is how I spent most of my time. And I'm not a social scientist, and I have no training in social science at all. I really did mostly focus on the biophysical sciences throughout my academic training. But I am definitely understanding more and more that this Western science worldview or knowledge system is one, and there are other equally valuable knowledge systems out there. So I'm trying to keep that in mind as I do my research as well. So you've probably heard about pollinator declines. It is a hot topic. Some might argue, and I will show you some information that might support this, that it's the most important environmental topic that people are thinking about these days. I don't think I agree with that, but it seems to be. It is often in the news, especially in the springtime. There's been quite a few high-profile studies about insect losses. There was the one from Germany a couple of years ago showing massive declines in insect abundance in protected areas over 30 years. That was the most highly shared on social media paper of that year. I have this bar chart here that shows the number of papers that look at pollinator declines in the past, I guess, since 1999 here. I started researching bees around 2004. So you can see I was totally one of the early adopters before it was a big thing. But since then, it's become a really hot research topic, in addition to something that people seem to be very concerned about. And people are worried about bees, and not just bees for the sake of bees, but also about the ecosystem services they provide to our food systems, to agricultural crops, but also to our ecosystems. So the pollination of our native wildflowers and shrubs and things that also feed our birds and bears and all those other things. What gets lost in the message is that there's actually a really high amount of diversity. There are over 1,000 species of bees in North America, closer to 2,000. There are many other insects that also provide pollination services. You may hear about butterflies. They're not the greatest pollinators, but there's also flies and beetles and wasps and all sorts of things. So there's immense diversity of insects that do provide pollination services. So just something to keep in mind when you think about how concerned people are about the loss of pollinators. So I'm going to talk more about sort of the research that I've done over the years. And this is one component of the work that I've done, which is documenting wild bee declines. On the bottom right here, I have a picture of the rusty patch bumblebee. So this paper that was published in 2008 was one of the first quantitative studies to show that a wild bee was declining, which is just so wild to think about it. At the time when people became concerned about bees around 2006 or 7 with the New York Times article about honeybee losses. I was one of the very few people studying bee decline, so it's kind of interesting how that all happened. But this bumblebee, the rusty patch bumblebee, was one that was very common in where I live in Southern Ontario. During my honors thesis, I actually was doing some survey work with some grad students and realized that it was missing and it should have been there, because in the 70s, a PhD student who had surveyed the area had found them to be the 4th most common species. And we didn't find any of them. So with this paper, I looked for them in some sites where it was supposed to be and resampled this area that this PhD student had surveyed and found that it was gone. And I've only found it in 2005 and 2009 at Pioneer Provincial Park in Canada. So those are the 2 last known spottings of this species in Canada. So it hasn't been seen since 2009. It's declined through the vast majority of its range in the eastern US, the Midwest, and Southern Ontario and Quebec. I've also worked on other species, so looking at sort of the broader North American species, not just focusing on this species, and then also most recently my PhD student, Victoria McPhail, is incorporating citizen science information as well as museum specimens to look at another species that seems to be at risk of extinction, which is Bombus pennsylvanicus. As Matt mentioned, I've helped coordinate the North American Bumblebee Red List assessment. So the bumblebees are a really small portion of our native bee species. There's about 50 in North America. We have 855 species or so of native bees in Canada. So it's really a small portion of our bees, but they are also the best known. They're the ones that we've been able to compile these data sets for, thanks to hundreds and hundreds of people who have been looking for them and depositing specimens into museums and that kind of thing. So of this small group of bees, we were able to assess all of the species to some extent. And what we found was that about a quarter of them are at risk of extinction. So this might go against what you may have heard, which is that all bees are going extinct and we're all going to die. But that being said, 1 in 4 bees, bumblebees, being at risk of extinction is not a good thing. I'm just saying maybe it's not as bad as you may have heard. And there are some species that are more in decline than others. So some, like the rusty patch bumblebee, have disappeared over just a few decades through parts of its range. And then some seem to be sort of more slowly declining. The species that are data deficient tend to be the ones in the north where we don't really have good either historical or recent data. But there are species that are doing quite well in urban areas. And yeah, for a variety of reasons that we don't need to talk about, I guess. But I just wanted to sort of give you a sense of the situation with that. So in addition to documenting the declines, I've also looked at the threats to wild bees, mostly bumblebees. So here are some examples we've considered with my many collaborators: climate change, pathogen spillover, habitat loss, all sorts of different things. And really what seems to be the main threat, at least to the species that I study, is pathogen spillover from managed bees. So kind of like we're living in COVID, the idea of a disease being brought in and wiping things out, something that our species have not evolved with, I guess, and for a long time. So I should have actually done a Zoom poll to see how many of you knew that that was one of our main threats to our native bees, because I suspect most of you don't know that. And then also climate change. And then there are things like habitat loss and pesticide use, which are definitely not doing bees any favors, but they don't seem to be what describes the patterns of losses that we've seen for the ones that are most at risk of extinction. And then more recently, I've moved into sort of more of the human dimension of pollinator conservation. I mentioned to you that I did my PhD work just looking for bees and counting rare species, and I did all the things that I thought I was supposed to do, which is provide the information and give it to the people that can make the decisions, and then things will happen to reverse the problem. But it didn't actually work out in that way as I thought it might. So if you collect evidence and you provide it, it doesn't actually mean that the policy that comes out of it will be evidence-based policy, which is something I've been learning, and I'll show you some examples of where I've learned that. But yeah, so I've tried to not only write these scientific papers, but also ones that are geared towards people who are doing conservation management. So I have some papers for policymakers. My colleague, Scott McIver, and I wrote this paper about essentially asking why are people conserving the honeybee in North America, given that it's a non-native and introduced species. Victoria McPhail is doing her PhD work really concentrating on Bumblebee Watch, which is a program we run with Wildlife Preservation Canada and Xerxes Society for invertebrate conservation, to look at how community scientists can help us gather data and solve problems and all of that. And then I've also been working a little bit about understanding stakeholder and the public's attitudes and awareness, because what my scientific training did not tell me is that these two things are what actually dictates the results of the environmental challenge that I'm dealing with. I've also worked with government, so writing up different reports about the statuses and recovery strategies for at-risk species. I was involved with the Toronto Pollinator Protection Strategy, which I'm pretty proud of. We were able to really focus on conserving native bees, native biodiversity, and focusing on species that were in decline. It's one of the few pollinator policies that do that. And as Matt mentioned, I also work on a bunch of things that are geared towards the public. So helping the public understand how to identify our different species of bees, to find rare species, or just to learn about the biodiversity that we have. And Bumblebee Watch is, as I mentioned, a citizen science program that we're running, or community science program that we're running, and it's a free phone app. So if you want to download it and help us look for rare species of bees, I highly recommend it. When people ask me how they can save the bees, this is actually the best way that you can personally save the bees, and it's free. So just go around taking pictures of bumblebees and sending this to us is extremely helpful. We've found a bunch of rare species. We are tracking species that are moving, and it's sort of adding to our larger data set, which is really useful. So please do join Bumblebee Watch. Okay, so given all of this sort of like academic or on the side type work that I've been doing, I've been thinking a lot about where the challenges are in pollinator conservation. So I'll go through some examples here. My PhD student, Adil, is looking at where pollinator decline literature, or she's doing a literature review of pollinator decline literature. And what she's found for the 500 papers that were published, I think since 2007, let me see here if I wrote it down, is that almost half of the papers are from the EU and the United States. So there's definitely a geographic bias to our literature base in this topic. Almost half, again, of the papers look at pesticide use and agriculture as threats to native bees. So this is purely pollinator decline literature, and these are the threats that are focused on. So pesticides and agriculture are the ones that are most commonly written about. But interestingly, even though we're talking about pollinator declines, if you look here, these species here are actually the ones that are managed and actually are among the most common species. So the vast majority of pollinator decline literature focuses on the most common and managed species, which is a little mind-boggling when you think about it as well. So this is kind of like an interesting thing to think about, because a lot of the times when people are talking about pollinator decline, they're probably not talking about the extinction risk, which is me as a conservation biologist, how I would interpret that, but they're actually thinking about declines in profits for people who sell or manage bees, if that makes sense. I'll get into that a little bit more. But so when people talk about decline, you have to think about whether or not they're talking about actual species decline, or if there's another thing that's being considered here. And in this case, I think it's increased costs associated with managing bees. We just recently had a paper published, I think it's still in early view actually, in Conservation Science and Practice. So this was led by Anissa, who's a PhD student in my faculty. So with Friends of the Earth Canada, we commissioned a poll from a polling company, and they interviewed 2,000 Canadians just to sort of gauge how they understand the situation around bees and pollinators and declines and all that thing. And not surprising, but still concerning, we found that over a half of Canadians think that the European honeybee is a wild and native bee, and 2/3 of them were unsure if this one species could replace all of our wild bees. About half of Canadians think all bees are endangered. Of all of these, only a single person named a solitary bee, which is just so mind-boggling, because of our 860 or so species, over 800 of them are solitary bees. So yeah, just really just kind of depressing. But at the same time, I grew up in the city and I thought yellow jackets were bees until I was in my 20s. So I totally get it. But this kind of just confirmed some of the things that we were understanding about how people were seeing this. And the vast majority, over 80%, believe that pesticide use and the loss of flowers were the two most important threats to declining bees. There are also in this paper some interesting things about political leanings. So if you were more interested in that, I don't have time to go into it here, but I definitely recommend it. So which party people align with and how they thought about bees. But in general, I would say that Canadians as a whole are concerned about this topic, regardless of the political spectrum that they kind of align with. And then there was also this Ontario pollinator policy that was put forth in about 2014, I believe. And this was probably a pivotal moment for me in my career for a lot of reasons. The government did this quite early on in their mandate. They put together this action plan discussion paper and posted on our Environmental Bill of Rights registry for public comments. Every single item that has to do with the environment, at least prior to this government, which has shut down public consultation, but previous to this government, the one before, and for many years before that, anything that had to do with the environment needed to be out for public comment. And this pollinator action plan got 52,000 comments, which is more than any other environmental issue since the existence of the Environmental Bill of Rights public registry. And around the same time, the same government also posted the climate action plan, which only got 500 comments. So this to me just kind of showed how obsessed, I don't know if that's a good word, but how important bees were to the average Ontarian, even more so than climate change, which I kind of disagree with, even though I'm a bee conservationist. And the policy that they put forth mostly focused on banning, I don't know if it said banning, reducing neonicotinoid pesticides. And there was a lot of stuff around honeybees in there as well. And my master's student, Allison Nichols, went through and coded some of the commentary that was written. So we have a paper that was just published on this. And generally what we found was that there's a broad interest again and support for protection of bees and the ecosystem service they provide, but that it doesn't really, the policy didn't end up aligning with the evidence. And the other thing that I learned about this incident was that lobby groups have a ton of power. So as I just mentioned, 52,000 people wrote in. 48,000 of these were form letters that came from NGOs, so the David Suzuki Foundation, Friends of the Earth, Ontario Nature, and beekeeping groups. But the lobby groups were the grain farmers who still wanted to use the pesticides. And over 95% of the comments written in were in support of reducing the pesticide use. But the lobby group still had so much power that when it came to it, this action plan ended up being downgraded to an aspirational target reduction with no enforcement. So in the end, even though this had the most public support of any environmental issue that I'm aware of, and since there hasn't been anything that's received as many comments since, the policy that came out of it was incredibly weak, and I don't really think led to very much. There hasn't been any follow-up on how much reduction of neonics has actually occurred. But in any case, the use of neonic pesticides are really a problem for beekeepers who bring in their honeybees into already degraded habitat. And the honeybees that are brought in are the ones that are more exposed to these pesticides. So yes, they are definitely a threat to the beekeeping industry. But as I mentioned before, it doesn't really describe the patterns of loss that we see for our bee declines. So we have this topic, and I know I'm very lucky to have chosen a group of species or a taxon that all of a sudden everyone became obsessed with. These are pictures from the UK and Australia. And I know that there are conservationists studying crayfish and I don't even know what kind of aquatic invertebrates who would love this kind of attention. So I find myself in this position of having a subject matter that I'm working on that has really intense public interest, more than I've ever seen for any other issue, and some political will because of the intense public interest. This National Geographic Facebook post asked, if you could dedicate your life to saving one species, what would you choose? And out of the 14,000 responses, the bee was the winner. I don't know if people were thinking of the honeybee or what, but clearly I have the dream job right now. So I've touched on this a few times, but the most mind-boggling thing about all of this is that North America's favorite bee and the subject of a lot of our policy is the European honeybee. So what does that tell us about ourselves? That we care so much about a species that was brought here by colonists. that competes with our native species, that hasn't co-evolved to pollinate our native species, that is entirely linked to our agricultural system. We bring in honeybee hives because the habitat has been degraded to a point where there's not enough natural bees to provide pollination, or we bring them in as an insurance so that things get pollinated because we're not sure if there's enough wild bees out there to pollinate. And this isn't just the industry with this messaging. So here's a Sierra Club post that's celebrating the European honeybee, one of the most common insects in the world, as endangered on Endangered Species Day. So this species has been introduced all over the place. And you can order them in the mail. Like, I think any of you could probably order a colony if you wanted to. Which I can't do with the actual endangered species I work on. So this to me has been like a massive struggle. And I think it points to some of the things I've been thinking about in terms of our disconnect, or the disconnect that settlers have to the land and the biodiversity that exists here, and the relationships that we have with the biodiversity that was here before us, and the plants that they co-evolved with, and all of that. I will also mention that there honeybees have a lot of diseases. Any managed animal has a lot of diseases, but increasingly we are seeing that the diseases from honeybees can spill over to wild bees. So in a way, our obsession, we know bees are in decline, but our obsession to like help the bees ended up increasing the number one threat, which is the increase of pathogen spillover. In Toronto, the number of honeybee hives has more than doubled since 2015 because people are interested in helping, and there are a whole bunch more hobby beehives in the city. So not sure what else to say about honeybees. Probably gone on enough about it. I guess the other thing about wanting to save the honeybee is that it shows me that our mentality around conservation is about something that we can manage. And environmental management is like a word that comes up in my work all the time. Actually, my position is assistant professor in environmental management, and I'm the sustainable environmental management coordinator for my faculty. But the idea of like managing nature, being able to bring in bees to replace an ecosystem service that was there, that should be there naturally, is just like a very like Western mindset, I think. And shows that disconnect. So that's something I'll just sort of talk about a little bit more. So after working on these species for like more than 15 years and actively designing my research so that I'm answering questions that I think will lead to the right policy movements to like solve the problem, we've basically gotten nowhere. The rusty patch bumblebee has not been seen since 2009. It still isn't being actively recovered in Canada. The recovery strategy was just written 10 years later after it was assessed. There are other species, 3 other species that are listed. And again, I'm talking about over 800 species of bees in Canada. So here I'm just talking about a handful of species that have been listed. But there's really no progress. In Ontario, we had this weak pesticide regulation that happened, but it's getting weaker with our current government. And some of the conversations around these policies have led to more animosity, I think, than solutions. With the Ontario Pollinator Plan, it really did pit the farmers against the ENGOs and the rural folks against the urban dwellers, who were the ones that were most likely writing in about this. So there's been a lot of animosity, and I'm not entirely sure that there's been any benefit to any of the declining bee species after all of this public support and all of this public will. So it kind of feels like we're in this situation. And there is this component where industry has co-opted the environmental problem. So bees are in decline, but there are a lot of people getting rich off of this. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And what it comes down to is that if we do want to reckon with what is causing bee declines, we need to reckon with systems that are quite large. So climate change, for example, or the unsustainable nature of our agriculture systems that don't allow for enough habitat to support free and wild pollinator communities to do the pollination services that are needed. So it does kind of come down to some questions around capitalism that all the people who are wearing the Save the Bee shirts, I'm not entirely sure there's that connection made. And unfortunately, that message around agriculture and climate is not as satisfying as planting a milkweed in your garden and calling it a day. So I've had some conversations with NGOs that are really trying to like provide these things like, oh, this bee condo or whatever, put in your yard and you're helping the bees. But I've had a lot of conversations about how that's not actually helping because people, it kind of disconnects people from like what the actual problems are. But we can talk about that later, I guess. There are also really good reasons for us to save wild bees for agriculture. And these are just titles of papers. Native bees provide insurance against ongoing honeybee losses. So if a disease comes through, like we saw with the, what was it called? Varroa mite. If you have enough wild bees in the system, your food will still get pollinated, even if the industry is having issues. So there's a monetary benefit to conserving native bees. Wild bees enhance fruit set of crops regardless of honeybee abundance. So regardless of if you have lots or few honeybees, they're still there to pollinate. Wild bee pollinators provide the majority of crop vegetation across land use gradients in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. This recent paper by Jessica Forrest, pollination by wild bees yields larger strawberries than pollination by honeybees. So this is just obviously a few papers, but there are quite a few papers now that show that there is actually a business argument for saving our wild bee diversity. I also think there's a really good reason to conserve bees if you're trying to also deal with climate change. One of the reasons is, of course, that diversity is resilient. So the more species we have in an area, the better we'll be able to deal with the climate changes that will be happening in the future, that we know will be happening. Some species come out early in the spring, some come out later in the summer. Some are out for the whole year, some are out for a couple of weeks. Some pollinate certain plants, some pollinate other plants. Having a lot of this diversity means that there is some room for, weather events that might be problematic. Conserving bees also lets you, or talking about conserving bees when you're talking about, when you're trying to get people to care about climate is also kind of an interesting thing to think about. Because so many people care about bees across the political spectrum, if we can shift that understanding to realize that there is this larger system that's a problem that needs to be dealt with, this might be a way to like get into that. I'm not sure. It's also, if people are paying attention to bees and flowers, like we hope they do when they're taking pictures of Bumblebee Watch, it's also a very visual representation. So where I live, we've had an increase of spring storms. So things will actually start to flower and then they'll freeze. And then you'll see that the bees, no longer have the food that was out there. And then that tree just never flowers because they were all frozen off. The blooms were all frozen off. So it is a way to get people to actually like accept that climate change is happening where they are. If you can get people out there and looking at bees and learning about the relationships that pollinators have with plants. And of course, climate is actually a threat to pollinators, one that we can discern is a pretty important threat to our pollinators and bees. Another thing that's not talked about too much is why we should conserve our bees if we're talking about food security or indigenous sovereignty. So just recently in one of my Facebook gardening groups, someone had mentioned, oh, I didn't get enough pollination on my squash plants this year. So I think next year I'm going to just have a honeybee hive so I can make sure that things are pollinated. But what that implies, and what people maybe don't recognize, is that beekeeping is a hobby. Beekeeping is for people. It is a hobby that requires space, time, and money. So it requires a certain amount of privilege. It requires you to probably like own land, to have the time to take care of your hive, and to have the space to have your hive. So it really is a privileged hobby. And I'm not really in beekeeping circles, but I would also think that they're probably not very racially diverse. And maybe there's socioeconomic patterns there as well. But beekeeping is definitely for people and not for bees. And community gardens, so gardens that are shared by people who don't have access to land in their own homes, but might live in apartments and share these gardens in a community garden setting. These generally depend on free pollination services. And people living in rural areas also who aren't honeybee keepers will depend on free pollination services as well. And having honeybee hives might displace or reduce these bee communities over time. So if here in the city of Toronto, all of a sudden there's like 800 new hives and they're providing some pollination services, but they're also spraying diseases and outcompeting native bees. So then the next year and the year after that, our wild bee abundances are lower. That has implications for the people who were relying on free pollination services for their food production. And another thing that is not really talked about a lot is that our native plants, which in a lot of cases include culturally important Indigenous medicine and food plants, have co-evolved relationships with our native pollinators. So having honeybees in the system or losing our native bees might actually impact the persistence of these culturally important food plants. Or plants that maybe culturally important animals rely on. So like blueberries need to be pollinated for bear seed, and that kind of thing. Yeah, and I guess a lot of people don't realize that actually a lot of crops are not well pollinated by honeybees. So we need wild bees or other types of bees to pollinate things like squash, tomato, blueberry, raspberry, peppers, and eggplants. Honeybees just don't do a good job. They don't know how to buzz pollinate. They're kind of fair weather animals. They do better in the sunny, warm days. So yeah, all of these are arguments as to why we need to focus on other things. So after working on all of this, I've been starting to think about who is being helped by my research and who is being harmed. So who is being helped? In the city of Toronto, we had this amazing pollinator policy that I'm really proud of. And part of it is this grant that helps homeowners create pollinator gardens. So people who already have land can apply for money and spend that money to make their pollinator gardens, which of course is not hurting the bees or anything, but it's just like one way that resources are being directed. It's being directed towards homeowners. There are businesses that are benefiting from this work through something that I think it was Scott McIver coined as bee washing. You can check out Charlotte de Keyser's website on bee washing. It's awesome. But there are businesses that are essentially saying they're sustainable because they put a honeybee hive on their roof or something like that. So that's one way that people are benefiting. There are people making money. So here are some bee condos that are for sale at Costco. So it's become so mainstream that you can sell your bee conservation tools at Costco. These people really, really won. They are the winners. This GoFundMe, they did 2 GoFundMes for these flow hives where you don't actually have to open the honeybee hive to access the honey. You just turn the tap and it like goes into these jars. These people, I think they got almost $20 million through their GoFundMe campaigns. And the way that they spun their product was that this is a very gentle way of extracting honey, and it was very nice to the bees because people were so worried about bees. They got a lot of money for this, but the beekeepers I've spoken to do not really recommend this style of beehive anyway. So there are definitely winners. I don't think the winners are the at-risk pollinators. I haven't seen any information that, at least in Canada where I live, that the species at risk of extinction have benefited at all from all of this money, all of this public interest or political will. But also I've been trying to think about who's being harmed, and that's a harder question. It's hard to know where these resources would go otherwise, whether they would go anywhere else. But I think it's something that scientists, conservationists need to think about for a lot of reasons. Last year, and I can't believe this was last year, it feels like it was 20 years ago, I was in Mexico, and I visited the overwintering habitat of the monarchs. So these like clusters on this pine tree are actually all butterflies clustered together. This is how they spend their winter. And what really struck me about all of this was that the community was doing the conservation here. So they were trying to eke out a living, doing ecotourism with these like horseback riding up to see the monarchs. And they actually had like a donation jar, like for you to like put in your pennies to help them with their conservation efforts. And $5 goes a really long way here in terms of conservation and monarchs. But where I am in Canada, people are easily spending $5, $10 on a single milkweed plant. And this really got me thinking about where the money should best be, I guess, given for the conservation of the species, which is probably these communities that are doing this important work at the overwintering sites. And also just how much, how a little bit of money would go really long way in this, but how that's not really being directed towards this kind of thing in the monarch world. I've also been thinking a lot about pollinator gardens and what makes an acceptable pollinator garden. So something like this on the right side where it's like beautiful, it's structured, that most people would say like, okay, that's great, I really like that. But why does that have to be a pollinator garden? Why can't it be this picture, which is a community garden where people are also growing food and they're not landowners? Or this field of ragweed, no, of goldenrod. People often think of as ragweed, but this is actually what, you know, a fall field should look like in Ontario, even though this plant is not really considered valuable or beautiful by a lot of people. And then thinking about areas with low socioeconomic demographics, I guess. So things that might be considered abandoned or unkempt, but these places do provide habitat as well. But they're not as valued. And in fact, in Toronto, if someone had something like this and they, you know, were too elderly or couldn't cut their grass and their neighbors reported them, they would actually be sent the bill for the city to come and mow down all of this habitat, pollinator habitat. So there is a lot of value that goes into us deeming what is a pollinator garden and what is valuable. So that brings me to Finding Flowers, which is my most recent research project. And this is led by myself, Lisa Myers, who's a faculty in the same faculty that I'm in, and Dana Prieto, who's our research associate, who's organizing all of this. And our objective is to understand the relationships between people and plants and insects, because I think what I've come to learn is that even if you have all of this political will and public interest, if there is a disconnect in terms of what we are supposed to be conserving and why, then we don't get very far. So this project to me might help me get to that place where I can sort of think about that connection. So the project is interdisciplinary. Lisa and I were talking, and she's an art curator, Indigenous art curator, and but we had things in common. She studied things like blueberries and goldenrod, and she was interested in food. So through our various conversations, we thought about doing this project that combines art and science. And we'll have an interactive website up soon. It's findingflowers.ca, but we're also on Twitter and Instagram if you wanted to check us out there. COVID kind of put a halt on a lot of the things that we were trying to do, but we're still going to keep going. And there's a lot about this project that I won't be able to talk about, but one of the I guess main thrusts is for us to consider this environmental problem of pollinator conservation and think about solutions using diverse knowledge systems and worldviews, and thinking about different ways of creating knowledge together. And I first started thinking about a biocultural approach through my time with the Lieber Air Fellows and meeting Jean Pulfus, who was doing amazing work in this area on caribou with her dechnes collaborators. So definitely check out Jean's work as well. The Finding Flowers project is inspired by the work of this Mi'kmaq artist, Mike MacDonald. He created video artworks, and this is really Lisa's part of the project, doing this kind of like history and learning about his work. But in the 80s and 90s, he was filming some documentaries in northern BC and the Gitxsan, Wet'suwet'en Nations, because he was documenting some issues around some land claim challenges that were going on there. And while he was shooting, he was observing butterflies that were in areas that were threatened by logging. So he decided to learn more about them, and he spoke to elders, and through his speaking to the elders and observations, he thought more about this link of butterflies to healing plants. So one of the elders told him, if you're feeling sick, follow the butterflies and they'll lead you to the plant that you need to like take to feel better. And thinking about this, what kind of teas do you drink when you are feeling ill, like chamomile or peppermint or whatever? These are all pollinator plants. So it's just kind of interesting that this observation does align with my worldview in terms of where I look when I'm looking for pollinators. So after this time he spent in BC, he decided to work on this a few other artworks, but one of them was butterfly gardens. And he planted them. We're not entirely sure how many he planted, but they were all across Canada. And he was making them as art exhibits, but also as places to contemplate and think about converting the land back to what it was. And he was very thoughtful. He used only local plants. He did use some local plants, but he also, in this picture here, you can see there's some hops growing along the pole. So Lisa's been researching this a little bit more. So he mostly used native plants, but there's also some tension with some invasive plants at these gardens. So we're really looking forward to seeing how this will all evolve and how we will learn more about it through reinstating some of the gardens that he planted and learning more about how he did the work that he did. There's only one of these gardens that were still in existence before our replanting some of them, and that's at Banff, in our gallery in Banff. So yeah, and then once these gardens are installed and as they grow, we're going to try to get people out there observing the plants and pollinators and helping us to collect information, but also having discussions about what they're observing. And that will help us understand a little bit more about these connections that we have. So I don't have too much time, but I didn't really talk too much about the social justice part of it. I guess you can see that there are themes of power and privilege that come through in a lot of the research that I do in terms of my topic, but also I'm thinking about how I need to change what I do. And the Finding Flowers project is kind of interesting, especially in COVID, because we've been able to pivot a little bit to support Indigenous community gardens with our planting money, to hire Indigenous bead artists to make our speakers gifts. And really just, I'm trying to approach my research now and trying to think about how I can shift resources into ways that are meaningful and that will help address some of these issues that I've come to see. So with that, I'll just acknowledge my many, many collaborators, and there might be a few minutes for questions.
Thanks, Sheila. There is one question in the chat from like the beginning of your talk. Linda McDougall asks why you think bees are doing well in urban areas, and her guess is less agriculture and neomix, but it is a
yeah, I guess cities are shelters from a lot of the agricultural threats that we have. So like there was probably less diseases from managed bees until this hobby beekeeping thing took off. And yeah, people use less pesticides, and then maybe some of the things around climate change are mitigated. So like if there's a drought, people will water their plants and the flowers will then survive and that kind of thing. So, but the common species that occur in cities are also quite common in agricultural areas as well. So I don't know if I can say that things are doing better. I guess I just meant that there are species that seem to be adapting to our land uses that are not what you would think of as good for bees, and that they're not all in decline.
Just a reminder for folks, if you want to ask a question, you can raise your hand in the participant list, or if you turn on your, I think Sheila, if you stop sharing your screen, I can see people's faces when they turn on their cameras. While we're waiting, or while folks are thinking about their question, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, you sort of started the talk by full disclosure on your social science training. And I wonder if you could talk about the places where you felt like that has been really hard and the places where you're actually kind of glad that you are coming to these questions with a different lens. Because I can imagine that's a positive and a negative.
Yeah, so I guess I don't know how to answer that question other than I will say that my first postdoc that I hired was a social scientist. So I'm trying to surround myself with the people who can help guide these problems and think about these questions in different ways than I do. And hopefully that will help us develop research that is more useful and holistic, I guess, and that it takes all these different perspectives and approaches. I think I was kind of blindsided, to be honest, by the human dimension of pollinator conservation. I truly was naive thinking that I could just document declines and that things will kick in and people will start saving the bees that were declining, but it didn't happen. So I don't know if I can really say that there's any benefit to not having this background.
Rebecca adds to that saying that it seems like there is a lot of opportunity for integrating some of the policy studies and critical social science. Some of the things we talked about before the seminar started about different kind of policy theories that might help explain why awareness of the problem isn't necessarily leading to changes in the policy outcome. There's a bunch of questions coming in the chat now. One is, why do you think the agency response around the rusty patch bumblebee has been so different in Canada versus the US? That's from John Mola.
Yeah, so I think part of it is how just the parties came in to be, because the rusty patch bumblebee was listed a long time ago, and then we had like this right-wing party that like put everything on pause for a long time, and now there's catch-up, whereas the rusty patch bumblebee in the US got in right before the Trump administration made those changes, so there was kind of this flurry of activity. So it's just something about our process too of listing, and I guess federalism also comes into play because most of our jurisdiction is at the provincial level and not the federal level, whereas it's like top down, as you remember from Andrea Olive's presentation in the US. So there's just like all these different structures that come into play that probably explain those differences.
Then I think I want to try and combine Lauren and Callie's question just here at the end and try and figure out, so what opportunities might there be to expand what the public is willing to support beyond just sort of save the bees? And I guess related to that, Callie's question about whether there are some parts of this maybe misdirected Save the Bees campaign that could actually lead to benefits for native bees, or is the whole thing sort of aimed too far in the wrong direction?
Yeah, I'm not too sure. But Lisa and I like to joke that we bring people in with the pretty bees, or sorry, the cute bees and the pretty flowers, and then we force them to have these hard conversations about colonialism and, you know, land claims and all of these things. So I do think the opportunities are that people are interested, so they will come in to have those conversations. And once you have their attention, you can bring up some of the more challenging things that maybe would not have brought them in the first place, if that makes sense.
The charismatic microfauna approach.
Yeah, and pretty flowers, right?
So we are at time. I don't know if you can see, there are some call outs for you, Sheila, in the chat. I know Sheila has some additional time, so if folks want to hang out and have a conversation, just kind of turn your camera on. And then for the rest of you, just a reminder, you'll get an email to today's recording at the same email address that you registered. And we'll be back next Friday with Janaki and her presentation on edge habitats. So have a good rest of your week. And if you want to stick around and chat with Sheila, I'll stop recording here and you can turn your video on and we'll have a conversation.